Okay, AP, we are going to do this as a screen share today. I don't think you need to see me. I'm going to relieve your eyes today. You don't have to look at me today. I have a few things to share with you, and sometimes it's too small when we're on the Zoom recording. And so we're just going to jump right into where we left off, and we're going to talk about sort of this, what does culture, what does society look like pre-Revolutionary War? And so we're going to go ahead and jump into the idea of like social status and structure. So in the book, they've got a pyramid, and you could see that the overwhelming majority of people are farmers, small farmers. They make their living off of their own land. There are people below them who maybe have to be hired out. The book mentions that as New England families had more and more kids, there was less and less land to give away. It's kind of the same thing that played out in England. And so what you have is, either these sons leaving to go out west and push on the frontier, or if they're unwilling to do that, have to have less land or be hired out. So that would be below the landowners. And then below them, you had indentured servants, and then artificially below them would be slaves. And so you have this structure for the majority of the people, but then at the top of the pyramid, you would have professionals, but at the very top, you'd have clergymen. And I'm going to save this for when we're in a live session, but I'm very curious to what you think that social strata looks like today. I don't think it is a pyramid. I think it is more like a rectangle. We just did demographics in our last lecture. 15% are in poverty, so that's too many. And we could debate about the poverty line, whether it's low enough or not, or high enough or not. Wait, did I say it wrong? Whether or not the definition of poverty should be raised as far as income, because it is awfully hard to raise a family on what is just above the poverty line right now. But I still don't think it's quite the triangle that it was. And we'll save that discussion for our live session. But there was more social mobility in the American colonies than there was in Great Britain, for example. And so that's something that America has always rightfully hung its hat on, that you could be born, poor one way or the other and lift yourself up to whatever you think the top of that structure is. So in general, you had a larger gap financially in the South, and that's because it goes back to that whole thing. After Bacon's Rebellion, some people were able to say, well, these indentured servants are too dangerous of a work source, so I'm going to go ahead and financially stretch myself to, I don't even like to say this, purchase slaves, which insane. But that then gave them more revenue, which allowed them to purchase more slaves, which allowed them to gain more riches. And for example, you have those FFVs. So that gap, if you couldn't afford it early on, it just got harder and harder as those large tobacco plantations got larger and larger and larger. All right, so who's at the top of the rung besides rich people like Southern plantation owners? Well, absolutely the ministry, clergy. Now, no shade being thrown on modern clergy. One of my best friends growing up, he has a church in Florida, and so no shade at all. But out of all the things that I could say about my friend, rich is not one of them. But at that time, you would make a decent living, and you would be the most respected person in the community. Certainly, clergymen are respected, but I don't know if, well, let's put it like this. Sports Center doesn't cover the clergy. It's certainly not what it appears that our society values the most. Now, physicians are not very high up on the list then. Now, today I would argue that physicians are very high up on our list of who are respected. Just think of the question I'm going to ask you when we're in a live session is that I'm supposed to have my 30th reunion this year sometime. And what profession would it be that I could say that would impress people? Teacher? Doctor? That would probably be pretty impressive. Your answer to that gives you a pretty good idea of what we value in American society. But back then, no, doctor was not viewed with that level of respect that hopefully we give it today. The reason is the profession was not as, let's say, well-defined. It was not as, you could kind of call yourself a doctor, whereas today, you have to earn that medical degree. So they just had some really barbaric medical practices. I mean, in Europe, for the plague, just 100 years before this, they were still saying, oh, you could do things like drink molten gold. What? Far more common, though. Far more common would be leeching, the idea that bad blood is what made you feel bad. So very infamously, George Washington had really serious dental problems. And so he had a lot of lesions in his mouth. To heal that, they often packed his mouth with leeches to suck away the bad blood in your gums. No wonder you don't respect your doctor. Up until the day Washington died, he was being regularly leeched on his arms and legs to get rid of whatever must have been ailing him. So again, that's why I didn't have quite the same respect. Now, the law profession, that gains a little bit more. I think that's a very highly respected position today in many circles. Not all, but back then, being a lawyer wasn't tremendously respected at first, but as you get closer to the revolution, you start to see lawyers have this ability to, sort of put some legal holes in some of the rules that the English are trying to enforce upon us. And it's no coincidence that I believe the most common profession among the signers of the Declaration of Independence, or maybe it's the Constitution, were lawyers. Second, by the way, was teachers, or at least had been at one point teachers. The most common profession, though, by far then, the most common job and social structure, social status, was farmer. 90% of Americans were farmers. Wrap your head around that. 90% of Americans in our first census, 1790, they listed their profession as farmer. Today, that number is 2%. Now, farming is as important today as it was then. No farmers, no food. But 2% of the population can now provide the food for this nation and, have enough to trade with other nations. But back then, almost everybody was a farmer. That's just what everybody was. Today, it's a very specialized profession that only 2% of people are engaged in. And then they kind of go through, Maryland and Virginia, that was much more about tobacco. But your middle colonies, that's where the grain was grown, your foodstuffs. Fishing was a fairly common profession, particularly in New England. Manufacturing, not so much. If the little manufacturing there was mostly in New England. But at this point, because of the laws, the navigation laws, we're really supposed to be buying most of our finished products from England anyway. There were things we made, though. Local communities, we didn't import everything from Great Britain. But there were, specialty items that we were making. Kill Devil rum, which was said so fast as I was taught it, Kill Devil, that I didn't even realize that it's two words, Kill Devil rum. So really, really strong alcohol. There's a lot of raw materials being exported. That's sort of our purpose. We're supposed to, under this system, this economic system, enrich the English. We're English, so it's not even like a separate thing. In theory, we're English colonies. Now you're going to see we feel less and less English as time goes by. But we're supposed to enrich the colonies. They'll make, or the mother country, the mother country of England will make the finished products for us. We provide the raw materials. In particular, really strong in lumber in general. Now, they also let us make some ships. And that's because as a naval power, Great Britain needs as many ships as they can. And we're producing something like a third of all of the merchant marine ships, which basically commercial vessels. But very important are the raw materials to make ships. Now, your book uses the term naval stores. Over the years, people have been confused about this. A naval store is an item, a thing you need to make your Navy. It's not literally a place where you go to buy stuff for your Navy. So naval stores, things you need to build up your Navy back then, like tar, pitch, and rosin. Those were things that essentially made things waterproof in many cases. But this system that we had where we're supposed to be enriching the mother country starts to fall apart a little bit as our population is growing at a much greater rate. So we need more finished products than England is churning out, and we are providing more raw materials than they need because we have these huge amounts of natural resources in this quote-unquote new world in North America, and our population is growing so fast. So what we end up doing is just trading with other countries. We then get in the habit of trading with whoever gives us the best prices. It happens a little bit with us buying finished products, but it happens even more with us selling our raw materials. The English do not like this. They passed the Molasses Act, which is just another navigation law, which says, hey, you can't, I mean, that one was aimed at the West Indies, but they're basically saying, hey, you can't do the deal that's best for you. You're supposed to do the deal that's best for the British colony. So everything's got to go through us. We extensively ignore this. We just become adept at smuggling. And it's one of the things that leads to tension. But man, we'd been doing this since Edmund Andros left. We'd been doing it before Andros had left. And then they ignore us so long that we just kind of get used to following our own sets of rules. All right, other things. So this is just a hodgepodge chapter about, various things. So that was financial. Let's talk about religion at the time. 2 major religions. Now, we had evolved to some degree to the point where we were no longer executing people who weren't sort of the more common faiths, but almost, say 95% of Americans at the time fit into 2 groups, one of these 2 churches. The Church of England, which was sort of that government-sponsored church established by the English. That becomes known as the Anglicans. Okay, it's just a name change that occurs over that 100 years. So the Church of England would have been called by this point the Anglicans. Today, that church is essentially the Episcopal Church. So that church still exists. And if you know anything about the Episcopal faith, and it doesn't matter if you do, but if you do, there are a lot of similarities between the Episcopal Church and Catholicism. They're very close on the spectrum together. Well, that's because, remember when the Church of England was originally created, it was by the defender of the Catholic faith who ended up leaving that church so he'd have the authority to have an annulment with his wife. So I'm going to read a quote directly from Bailey about the Anglican Church. It was, quote, less fierce and more worldly than the religion of Puritan New England. Sermons were shorter, hell was less scorching, and amusements like Virginia fox hunting were less scorned. So it was a little bit more laid back. Now, the other half of the country were Puritans, but Puritans also went through sort of a name change, and that became much more known as Congregationalists. So Congregationalists are like what we're thinking of in Massachusetts in particular and in New England in general, those who came over for these particular religious reasons. Now, couple graphic organizers. I've had this one up here, Political and Social Pendulum. To explain this next major event, one of the most important early events in American history, I wanted to show you this pendulum. And what I want to do is just, it's not perfect here, but this is a common political and social trend that you are going to see. Our country, and other countries, frankly, have this tendency, but you're free to do it in our country, have this tendency to have these swings. I want you to think, this graphic organizer isn't perfect because it won't swing for me, but they tend to swing back and forth. And what happens is, if your country goes through a conservative change, you kind of push and push and push and go more and more conservative until it reaches a breaking point, and then you tend to have a pretty big swing back liberal. And then, you get more and more and more liberal, and then you have a tendency to have that big swing back conservative. Now, politically speaking, for example, the Obama administration, I don't think it's as liberal as some people paint it, but it was on the liberal side of things. So you could absolutely paint the Trump administration as a conservative reaction going in this direction. Now, as things became more and more conservative, what you can say is, are we reaching a point now with all these protests that you start to see it turning back left? I'll have a better idea of that answer in November. But this happens in American history. It happens all the time, and it happens socially. So in general, by the way, and we're going to come back to this, and I'm not putting any value judgments on this. I'm just kind of telling you the way things are. In general, a liberal, by definition, is kind of more in favor of change, and a conservative, by definition, wants to keep things more the same. Now, I will say you can be so conservative that the change you want is to make things back the way that it used to be, if that makes sense. So I literally don't know of anybody this conservative in the mainstream right now, but if you were really, really conservative, you'd say, well, here's the change I want. Women shouldn't be working. They should be at home. Okay, that would be that would be a change, but that's actually a change going back to, say, maybe what this person had idealized about the 50s, okay? Liberals, much more willing and open to change. Again, not a value judgment on that, just a general idea. And by the way, somebody can be socially one way and politically another way. Example, just so we can wrap our heads around liberal and conservative. I happen to be politically very liberal. Now, again, I'm not pushing an agenda. There's lots of smart people on both sides, so I'm not saying one's right. I just happen to be very politically liberal. But personally, I'm pretty conservative, meaning when you see me, I have sort of, short, boring haircut, dress pretty much the same every day, brown slacks, blue shirt. That's a conservative look. So you could be sort of, he's conservative in how he dresses and appears, but liberal in how he votes or something like that. And you can be in reverse. That just gives you a concept. So what we're going to talk about here, this is all to set up the Great Awakening. And the Great Awakening is absolutely, and make sure you understand this correctly, a conservative response to what had been decades of liberal changes within the church. For decades, the church was bending more and more. Oh, hey, we'll let you, remember, initially you couldn't be in the church unless you had this conversion experience. Now we're going to let you in the church if you think you should have one because maybe your siblings did. Okay, that's the halfway covenant. That's very liberal. Then you start to see some preachers saying, listen, it's not predetermined. How you act, your actions, your good deeds can get you into heaven. That's even more liberal. So in the 1730s, what you have is this dramatic swing to the conservative. Okay, so I want to make this very clear. It is a big conservative swing. That pendulum is coming way up here as a reaction to the several decades of liberalization. That's what happens. That pendulum reaches that point, and it's slower and slower and slower, and then it swings back the other way kind of aggressively. And what you see is this revival where particularly, these Congregationalists, these, what we think of as Puritans, are saying, no, we came to this country for the religious, quote-unquote, freedom to have the Puritan faith be the right way. We don't want to sit in church with non-elect. And you start to see these preachers like Jonathan Edwards who are saying, hey, you are crazy. You're way off track. We have been way too liberal. We've got to get back on track. Then there's George Whitefield, who's very much a conservative reaction. But ironically, how he delivers his conservative message is in a new, unique way. He is what we are going to dub a new light, and that is because he is going to preach in a very, very excitable way. He's going to be, sort of lots of inflection in his voice and lots of excitement in his voice, and that became very common as a part of the Great Awakening. And we call the people that had this sort of new, dramatic style, new lights, and people who just sort of read the Bible to you in a more dulcet tone, an old light. Listen, some of our greatest speakers have had this new light style. It's no coincidence that Dr. King, who delivered one of the greatest speeches in American history, was in his primary occupation a pastor. He had that sort of new light fire so that he could he could read like probably a chocolate chip cookie recipe, and you'd be like, oh my gosh, I'm inspired. To kind of give you an idea of this, there's a Saturday Night Live sketch or not sketch, it's an event that occurred in the 80s where Jesse Jackson, who was a confidant of Dr. King's, and he was running for president, and he read Green Eggs and Ham on Saturday Night Live, I think as part of the news. He just read a Dr. Seuss book. And people went nuts because he read it with such spirit, and he might have gotten a standing ovation. So that sort of symbolizes that new light. But this Great Awakening, this is a big deal because, again, you have that halfway covenant. This is the liberal stuff going on that makes people go, oh my gosh, we've got to go back to the way things were. Now, out of that, we sort of discovered new lights, which then labels all the people that stay the same, old lights. You have, in general, far more interest in religion going on in the colonies at that time. Well, I'll make that point last. And then you have different Christian sects, which become much more popular, which become much more common because they have more room for emotion in them. And it's still true today. You could go to certain churches, and I think you're more likely to hear a preacher who's more emotive in certain, for example, like a Baptist church, than some of the other churches. It's just more a part of the structure or commonality, although there's always exceptions in every church and every religion. Now, why is all this important? I'll tell you the truth. It's not that important religiously for historical, U.S. history purposes. It's actually important because it ends up being essentially America's first mass movement. It shows that we are culturally, we're becoming more and more one entity, America. That's going to be a big deal because that's going to start emerging in the 1730s where we start identifying as America. America is going through the Great Awakening. Great Britain has it, but not to the same degree. And it's going to kind of unify us to some degree just to have gone through this experience. So we will come back to this another time. There's going to be a second Great Awakening, but really its big, long-lasting impact is that it is a mass movement of the American people. Okay. Now, again, this is the hodgepodge chapter. Let's go on to schools and colleges. Education, this one won't take as long. We're sorely lacking education in the United States in this colonial time. New England's doing better because, remember, you had to be able to read to be a quote-unquote good Christian. That's why so many of your best colleges, really the colleges that many of you will would just love to get into were established in New England. Let's read through some of the Ivy Leaguers here. Harvard, William and Mary, Yale, Princeton, Pennsylvania, Columbia, Brown, Rutgers, and Dartmouth. And they're all in Massachusetts, one in Virginia, William and Mary, Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, Rhode Island, New Jersey, New Hampshire. So now they left one off, in my opinion, founded a little bit later. Most of those were founded between 1636 and 1769, but they left off a late founder there, Bowling Green State University, 1910. I think that Ivy League of the Midwest Ivy. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, the average New Englander probably had more education, but the most highly educated individuals were often the rich children of plantation owners. All right, our last major topic to talk about, culture. Here's where we're really lacking. And we'll get into this in a couple different things here, but we just sorely lack culture in the colonies. I don't know if it's in this chapter or another one, but I believe it says they wouldn't be surprised if there was not one bathtub in colonial America. We just weren't known for our culture. We're viewed as backwoods, sort of backwards. Now, they do bring up the poetry of Phyllis Wheatley. That's true culture, but it's the exception, not the rule. Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac. That's probably what's going to pass for culture, and that's just sort of, folksy wisdom. I mean, this is kind of gross, but it is real. You can Google it. Benjamin Franklin wrote a pamphlet called, wait for it, Fart Proudly, in which he talked about how to make people's gastrointestinal gases smell better. That's what passed for culture in the American colonies at that time. We are backwards. We are super backwards at this time. And even go into science, sure, men like Ben Franklin, very famously, flew a kite and, quote unquote, discovered electricity or made an advancement towards electricity. Even this is oversold and undertold because, well, maybe not properly told. You see this woodcut here. This is how Benjamin Franklin sort of advertised to the world. He wrote a paper about this, what he found, and if you know anything about the scientific method, it should be able to be replicated. And fortunately, most people read the whole thing and realized that this woodcut was a dramatization, because in reality, this is not how it went down. Benjamin Franklin tied this famous kite and key to a tree branch and observed it from a distance because he knew if his theory was right, and people knew something killed people when they got struck by lightning, that you could be hurt by this. But because of the dramatic effect of this woodcut that just has him casually flying this kite and seeing the spark go off the key, People thought, oh, you can hold this. And Europeans replicating it using the scientific method who didn't read the paper fully died, were electrocuted. Oh, that's such an American thing to do at the time. Oh, to just go, oops, I left out this one important detail. Don't hold the kite. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, that's it for the major topics today. I will ask you, though, to ponder some questions for Tuesday's live session, and really for the recorded session on Tuesday, too. And that's about the media. We're going to talk about the media in Tuesday's lecture, and something that really sort of the idea of freedom of the press that really starts to grab hold in the 1730s in a way that had never been really expressed anywhere else, and something we hold on to very strongly here. To get ready for that discussion, I want you to ponder two general questions. Does the media have the right to print anything that it can prove is true? If you can prove it's true, should you be able to print it, no matter what it is, if it's true? And two, does a jury have the right to nullify or ignore a law? So if a jury just says, yeah, I know, but that's dumb, can they ignore it? That's what we'll talk about on Tuesday in both our live session and our recorded lecture. Okay, everybody, keep up on your reading. Have a great day, and we'll talk soon.